Welcome to Hard Script.
She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at me. She lifted her glass, smiled at the room, and said she felt free again. Not free like relieved. Free like released. Like a ribbon cut at an opening night. The room reacted exactly the way she wanted. Laughter, applause, a few phones lifting without anyone asking permission. That was her world. Reactions were currency. Silence was death. I stood next to her, still holding my coat. I hadn't even taken it off yet. I watched the reflection of her face in the mirror behind the bar, bright and practiced, and I didn't correct her. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't move closer. I did the one thing she didn't script. I stopped participating. This wasn't a private dinner. It was a launch party she'd produced for a media nonprofit, full of sponsors, editors, and people who introduced themselves by job title before their name. She thrived in rooms like this. I usually stayed near the edges, talking only when someone asked something precise. Systems, security, processes, things that either worked or didn't. No applause required. I noticed him before she finished her sentence. He wasn't standing close, but he was placed perfectly. A clean jacket, camera-ready posture. The kind of man who scanned faces the way others scanned exits. A television journalist. One of those guys who turned personal disasters into segments with theme music. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She didn't need to. He was already watching. People turned toward me. They expected a reaction. A laugh. A correction. A scene. That was the deal she thought we had. She provokes, I ground it. She floats, I anchor. Tonight, she cut the anchor loose in public. I set my glass down. I nodded once to the host. I walked past the table where my name was printed on a donor card. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. Before I reached the curb, I pulled out my phone and sent one message to a project lead who'd been waiting on my approval to greenlight a security rollout tied to the event. I withdrew my sign-off. No explanation, just a formal delay. Inside, she was still smiling, still free, still expecting something from me. I didn't go back in. By morning, the noise from the night before had already started to reorganize itself. Clips were circulating. Short ones, carefully framed. Her laugh. Her raised glass. The line about being free again. The camera never turned toward me, which told me everything about who had been directing the lens. I didn't comment. I didn't call her. I left the apartment exactly as I always did, moving through rooms without touching anything that wasn't necessary. On the way out, I noticed she'd left her tablet on the kitchen counter, still charging. It wasn't hidden. She'd never believed in hiding. Control worked better in the open. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The screen lit on its own with an incoming notification preview. A producer's name I didn't recognize at first, followed by a message that wasn't meant for me to see. It mentioned an angle, a follow-up, and a suggestion that the personal liberation narrative was landing well with audiences. That was the first clean confirmation that this wasn't impulsive. It was scheduled. At work, people treated me carefully. Not gently. Carefully. The kind of distance professionals keep when they know something personal is unfolding but don't want to be pulled into it. My manager asked if I was still comfortable overseeing an internal review tied to a media partnership. I said yes. My voice didn't change. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. During lunch, a colleague forwarded me a link without commentary. A culture segment hosted by the same journalist from the night before. He was discussing public reinvention. He didn't name her, but the examples were too precise to be coincidence. A successful event producer. A marriage that had become structural. A reclaiming of narrative. It wasn't gossip. It was packaging. I watched the clip once. Not to analyze him. To observe her. She was off camera, but she was present in every line. The pauses. The emphasis. The way he spoke like he'd been inside the situation long enough to feel entitled to interpret it. When I got home, she was already dressed to leave again. She spoke at me, not to me, filling the space with energy like she always did when she expected resistance. She mentioned meetings, opportunities, a conversation that had gone better than expected. I didn't respond. I took my laptop from the study, removed a folder that contained access credentials tied to joint accounts and shared platforms, and placed it in my bag. She noticed that. Her voice adjusted, softer, curious. I still didn't explain. That evening, I made one call. Not to her. To a lawyer whose number I'd kept saved for years and never used. I asked for a consultation. Not urgent. just precise. The story she was telling publicly had momentum. What she hadn't noticed yet was that I had stopped moving in sync with it. The consultation happened without drama. A quiet office. Glass walls. A man who listened more than he spoke. I explained only what was necessary. Shared assets. Public exposure. Media risk. He didn't ask why. He asked how clean I wanted the separation to be. I said clean enough that nothing leaked back onto me. After that, I stopped sleeping at the apartment. Not as a statement. As a logistical adjustment. I took a hotel room near my office and moved my routine there. She noticed the absence quickly. Missed calls. Messages stacked without escalation. She was used to confrontation as proof of relevance. Silence didn't fit her metrics. Evidence didn't arrive through confrontation. It surfaced through overlap. Her calendar synced to a shared cloud account we'd set up years ago for travel planning. She never unsensed it. I didn't open it directly. I watched the notifications roll in across devices I was still responsible for maintaining. Production meetings that weren't listed publicly. Dinners labeled vaguely. Travel blocks that didn't align with official events. One evening, while reviewing network logs for work, I noticed repeated connections from her laptop to a media company server. Not unusual on its own. What stood out was the timing. Late. Repetitive. Paired with large file transfers. I didn't access the content. I didn't need to. The pattern told the story. At the same time, her public presence accelerated. Photos appeared from locations she hadn't mentioned. Captions about reclaiming space. Interviews framed as thought leadership. The journalist's face began appearing in the background of group shots. Always just off-center. Always plausible. At work, a compliance officer asked whether I'd signed off on a new vendor tied to a broadcast partnership. I hadn't. The vendor traced back to the same network I'd flagged. I requested a pause. Not a rejection. A pause meant questions. Questions meant scrutiny. That evening, she finally pushed for a response. Her tone shifted through several registers without landing anywhere stable. She framed it as confusion, as concern, as curiosity about why I'd become distant. She asked whether something was wrong. I didn't answer the question she asked. I told her I was restructuring my commitments. I said it evenly, without edge, without reassurance. She laughed, lightly, like it was a phase. She mentioned how public attention could feel destabilizing for people who preferred quiet roles. She framed my withdrawal as temporary. I packed a second bag after that conversation. Only essentials, documents, devices, clothes that didn't carry memory. Before leaving, I disabled my access to shared location services and revoked my credentials from platforms we'd both used. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain. She was busy building a narrative that depended on my reaction. What she didn't see yet was that I had moved from observing patterns to removing variables. I didn't disappear in a dramatic way. There was no announcement, no final exchange, no moment she could replay later and frame as cruelty. I simply stopped being reachable. By morning, my number no longer rang through her phone. Not blocked. Deactivated. The shared credit cards were frozen through the attorney's office, flagged for review. The apartment lease was placed under reassessment. My name temporarily removed pending separation. Utilities shifted to automated billing under accounts she couldn't access. Small changes. Quiet ones. The kind that don't register immediately, but stack. I checked out of the hotel and moved again. A furnished place closer to work, paid monthly, no long-term trace. I redirected deliveries. Updated my address with exactly 3 institutions. No social accounts were changed. I didn't announce a break. Online, I remained exactly as I had always been. Invisible. Her reaction came in waves I didn't answer. Messages first, casual and light, written as if nothing was wrong. Then confusion. Then urgency. She sent voice notes I didn't open. She tried email. The tone sharpened. She framed my silence as unprofessional, then as childish, then as concerning. What she didn't realize was that concern still assumed access. That afternoon, someone from her circle reached out. A mutual contact who'd always played intermediary when she wanted to float an idea without owning it. The message was friendly. It suggested a misunderstanding. It implied that public life required flexibility from partners. It asked whether I was okay. I didn't reply. From a distance, I watched her adjust her output. Posts became more frequent. Captions grew longer, more explanatory. She shared images of movement. Backstage passes. Studio lighting. always forward-facing, always busy. The journalist appeared more openly now, no longer careful about angles. Then the first real disruption hit. An event she was producing lost a key sponsor. Quietly. No announcement. Just a reshuffling that forced her team to make last-minute changes. Another collaborator postponed. A venue contract stalled in review. Nothing catastrophic. Just friction. The kind that makes professionals start checking their footing. That evening, she posted less. The next day, nothing at all. I stayed off the grid, she understood. No calls returned. No explanations offered through third parties. When my lawyer sent formal notice of separation, it arrived without commentary, stripped of emotion, written in neutral language that didn't validate a performance. She tried once more to pull me back into the frame by escalating publicly. A vague quote about abandonment, about strength, about choosing herself. It didn't land the way she expected. Without my presence to react against, the story lost contrast. I wasn't watching her closely anymore. I was watching the effects. And they were just beginning. I didn't go after him directly. That would have given him what he wanted. Visibility. Conflict. A role in the story he was already drafting. Instead, I stayed where I'd always been strongest. In systems no one noticed until they stopped working. The journalist had patterns. Public figures always do. They move fast, rely on access, assume their reputation insulates them from questions they're used to asking others. He crossed between editorial and production more than he demonstrated. That overlap was where things tended to fray. At work, my team was already conducting a routine internal audit tied to external media vendors. It wasn't about him. It didn't need to be. His employer used the same infrastructure as several partners we were reviewing. Compliance was part of my job long before he entered my life. I flagged inconsistencies without attaching names. Data handling issues. Conflicts between declared roles and actual access levels. Nothing accusatory. Just documentation. That documentation went through channels designed to move slowly but thoroughly. Separately, I passed along a recommendation to a contact in legal affairs at a different firm. Not a warning. A courtesy. The kind professionals exchange when they notice something that could become inconvenient later. No names again. Just risk categories. The effect wasn't immediate. It never is. But momentum shifted. A segment he'd teased didn't air. A podcast appearance was postponed. He stayed visible, but the tone changed. Less certainty. More defensiveness. He began over-explaining his process on social platforms, which only drew attention to the seams. She felt it before she understood it. Her proximity to him became more obvious. Less curated. Less celebratory. She stopped framing their connection as symbolic and started framing it as misunderstood. That pivot always signals pressure. When someone moves from confidence to clarification, something underneath has started to wobble. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, casually, that the journalist seemed distracted at a recent gathering, preoccupied with emails, with calls that pulled him aside. He laughed it off, apparently, but not convincingly. I didn't follow up. I didn't need confirmation. Systems tell you what you need to know by how they resist. That evening, she tried again to reach me through a professional channel. An assistant forwarded a message asking if I'd be willing to consult on a security issue for an upcoming event. Framed as business. Neutral. Controlled. I declined through my lawyer. Briefly. Without justification. The next day, the journalist posted a vague statement about integrity and transparency. No names. No context. The kind of statement people make when they want to preempt questions they know are coming. I didn't watch it twice. I didn't save it. I had already stepped far enough away that the noise no longer pulled me in. What mattered was that the structure she'd attached herself to was starting to show stress. And she was standing on it in public. The shift became visible in rooms I no longer entered. She was still invited, but the invitations changed texture. Fewer headline events. More panel discussions. More last-minute confirmations. The kind of professional courtesy that looks the same on the surface but feels colder when you arrive. I heard about it through people who didn't realize they were carrying messages. A colleague mentioned seeing her at a fundraiser where she'd once been central and now seemed peripheral. Still smiling. Still working the room. But the smiles didn't land the same way. Conversations shortened. People checked their phones sooner. The journalist's name stopped opening doors for her. It didn't close them either. It just stopped functioning as leverage. At one event, someone asked a question she wasn't prepared for. Not accusatory. Just curious. A casual remark about blurred lines between coverage and personal involvement. The kind of comment that sounds harmless until it echoes. She laughed it off, but the room adjusted. Not against her. Away from her. That's the difference people underestimate. Her team felt it too. Assistants started asking for clarification more often. Partners wanted revised scopes. Decisions that used to slide through now required review. Friction spread quietly, without a single identifiable source. I remained absent. Not just physically, socially. My name stopped appearing next to hers. There were no joint appearances to reference. No shared context to stabilize her position. The contrast she'd relied on was gone. She tried to rebuild it. She mentioned me once in an interview, carefully, as a grounding presence, as someone private, as someone who preferred systems to spotlight. It was meant to reintroduce me as subtext, to pull my outline back into her story. It didn't work. Without my participation, the reference felt hollow. Viewers didn't react. Commentators didn't pick it up. Silence followed where she'd expected curiosity. At a family gathering I didn't attend, someone asked where I'd been. Not dramatically, just neutrally. She answered with something vague about space and growth. No one pressed. That was worse. The lack of interest landed harder than disbelief. Later, I was told she left early. I saw the effects in smaller ways too. Her posts stopped performing. Not collapsing, just under-delivering. Engagement dipped below thresholds sponsors watched closely. The journalist appeared less often beside her now, replaced by solo shots that felt defensive. She was still visible, still working, still standing, but the room no longer leaned toward her. I stayed where I was, outside the frame, unreachable. The absence had stopped being a provocation and become a condition. And conditions, once set, are difficult to reverse. Her isolation didn't arrive all at once. It layered itself in small omissions. People stopped checking in. Not deliberately. They just assumed she was busy, successful, surrounded. That assumption creates distance faster than conflict ever does. When no one thinks you need support, they stop offering it. She reached outward anyway. Old contacts, former collaborators, familiar names she'd once been able to summon with a single message. Responses came slower, polite, non-committal. Everyone was booked. Everyone was traveling. Everyone would circle back. They didn't. I stayed visible only where it mattered. At work. In routines that didn't require validation. I didn't post. I didn't explain. My life reduced itself to essentials and became quieter because of it. No one asked questions. No one speculated. Absence reads differently when it's consistent. She tried once to bridge the gap without words. A calendar invite appeared from her assistant, framed as a neutral meeting to discuss logistics. I declined through the same channel. No alternative dates offered. No reason given. After that, the tone shifted. She started appearing where I was likely to be, without contacting me directly. Industry mixers. Public talks. Spaces that overlap professionally but not socially. I noticed the pattern before I noticed her. The way energy in a room tightens when someone arrives expecting an outcome. She never approached. She lingered near conversations. Positioned herself within sight lines. The performance was subtle, waiting to be noticed without asking to be seen. I didn't look. The journalist wasn't with her anymore. Not visibly. When his name surfaced, it came with qualifiers now. Past tense references. Deflections. The narrative had cooled, and without momentum, it no longer justified proximity. At one event, someone asked her directly whether the attention had been worth it. Not critically, genuinely. The kind of question that comes from curiosity, not judgment. She answered carefully. Too carefully. The answer didn't travel beyond the moment. Later, I heard she left early again. That night, she sent a single message. No framing. No explanation. Just a question asking whether we could talk. No urgency markers. No accusations. Just an attempt at re-establishing access. I didn't respond. The next morning, she followed up with something more personal. A reference to shared history. A memory she assumed still held weight. It didn't move me. Memories without presence lose their leverage. She stopped after that. Her public output slowed. Not dramatically, just enough to feel uncertain. She was still standing, still functioning, but without feedback, her movements lost precision. Isolation had replaced resistance. I wasn't watching closely anymore. By the time she realized I wasn't coming back into orbit, The space around her had already hardened. The confrontation didn't happen the way she would have planned it. There was no dramatic crossing of paths, no raised voices, no audience. It happened in a neutral space where nothing echoed. I was leaving a building I visited regularly, one that had nothing to do with her world. She was waiting near the entrance, positioned just far enough away that it could still look accidental. When I stepped outside, she turned as if surprised, then stopped pretending. She didn't approach quickly. She adjusted first, straightened her coat, smoothed the version of herself she wanted me to see. By the time she spoke, her voice had settled into something measured. She framed it as concern, as confusion, as a need for clarity. I listened without responding, not out of restraint, out of distance. The words passed without finding purchase. She asked why I had disappeared. She asked whether I thought silence was fair. She asked whether this was punishment. I didn't correct her language. I didn't reassure her. I let the space do the work. She shifted tactics. She referenced pressure, missteps, a moment that had gotten bigger than intended. She framed the public declaration as symbolic, not literal. She implied I should have known that. She implied I'd misunderstood. I told her I hadn't misunderstood anything. I said it evenly, without emphasis. That was the first sentence I'd spoken to her in weeks. She reacted to the sound of my voice more than the content. For a second, she leaned forward, as if proximity alone might pull me back into alignment. She asked what I wanted. I didn't answer directly. I said I had already adjusted my life accordingly, that the legal process was underway, that communication would continue through appropriate channels. She asked whether there was anything left to salvage. She asked whether I still recognized what we had built. I looked at her then, not critically, not warmly, just long enough to register that the version of her standing there was waiting for permission to pivot, waiting for resistance she could negotiate against. I didn't give it to her. I told her I wasn't available for reinterpretation, that the conditions she'd created no longer included me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. I stepped back after speaking, signaling an end she couldn't interrupt. She stood there as I walked away. I didn't check whether she followed. I didn't look back. Later, I learned she stayed where she was for a while, long enough for it to become noticeable, long enough for someone to ask whether she was all right. She said she was fine, but the question lingered in the air longer than she expected. Her collapse didn't announce itself. It unfolded quietly, in places where applause couldn't reach. The journalist disappeared from her proximity completely. Not publicly, just functionally. His name stopped surfacing in connection with hers. Invitations that once arrived as pairs now came singly, or not at all. When someone asked about him, the answers were short and non-committal, as if the subject had expired. Projects began slipping, not failing outright. Drifting. A delayed confirmation here. A revised budget there. The kind of erosion that doesn't trigger alarms, but leaves people uneasy. Sponsors hesitated. Partners requested contingencies. The certainty she once projected no longer held. She tried to compensate by increasing output. More visibility. More explanations. She leaned into language about resilience and reinvention, but without momentum behind it, the words thinned. Engagement flattened. The feedback loop she depended on stopped reinforcing her choices. At a gathering she attended out of obligation, someone mistook her role, introduced her as an assistant instead of a producer. It was corrected quickly, but not cleanly. The moment lingered. People registered it. She smiled through it, but the smile didn't travel. That night, she left early again. The real break came when a major client restructured their event strategy and didn't include her. No confrontation. No justification. Just a polite notice thanking her for past collaboration and wishing her well. She reached out through intermediaries. The response was delayed, then closed. Family noticed the change before she acknowledged it. Fewer calls. Shorter visits. Conversations that stalled. She tried to hold on to normalcy, but without stability elsewhere, even familiar spaces felt provisional. She sent one last message to me, not asking to talk, not asking for anything specific, just stating she hadn't expected things to end this way. I didn't reply. By then, my life had settled into a different rhythm. Work progressed. My name circulated in contexts that didn't involve explanation. People trusted me with responsibility without needing to understand my personal history. I slept well. I moved through days without anticipating interruption. Her world, built on reaction, had gone quiet. Not hostile, Not cruel, just indifferent. When people stopped watching, she didn't know where to place herself. The platforms that had amplified her choices offered no guidance when the signal dropped. She had no one to push against, no resistance to define her edges. I wasn't nearby when it fully registered for her. I didn't witness the moment. I didn't need to. The absence she had tried to weaponize had become permanent, and it no longer belonged to her. The last time I heard her name, it came without weight. Someone mentioned it in passing during a conversation that had nothing to do with her. A reference to an event that hadn't landed. A project that had quietly changed hands. No emotion attached. No curiosity. Just context. Then the conversation moved on. That was when I knew it was finished. There was no final message from her after that. No escalation. No public reframing. Whatever attempts she'd considered, she abandoned them. Without an audience, performance loses purpose. The legal process concluded the way these things do when there's no resistance. Clean. Procedural. Efficient. Assets separated. Responsibilities clarified. No commentary leaked. No narratives contested. Her signature appeared where required. So did mine. Two parallel lives, formally unlinked. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel loss. I felt alignment. My days had structure again. Not imposed. Chosen. I worked. I trained. I slept. I moved through spaces where my presence wasn't interpreted or leveraged. People responded to what I did, not what I represented. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of her online. Less frequently now. The tone had changed. Fewer declarations. More neutral updates. She still existed publicly, but without urgency. Without the sharp edges that once demanded attention. She had said she was free again. What she hadn't understood was that freedom without grounding drifts. Without resistance, without boundaries, it dissolves into noise. She had cut herself loose and mistaken the fall for flight. I didn't disappear out of spite. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I stepped out because the structure no longer held. Because staying would have required me to perform a role I hadn't agreed to. There was nothing dramatic about the ending. No confrontation scene. No final exchange that could be quoted or reposted. Just a gradual removal until there was nothing left to react to. That's what made it permanent. If she ever looks back, she won't find a moment she can rewrite. No argument she can reinterpret. No outburst she can frame as mutual damage. She'll find a gap. A space where something used to be, and then wasn't. I didn't vanish. I simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. And when I left, I took the silence with me. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.